Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel discussion is there feedback? No, okay. On the pandemic behind bars, COVID-19 in US prisons. This event is hosted by the UMass Amherst Prison Abolition Collective, which I am a member of. My name is Claire Healy, and we are a student-run organization advocating the end of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex at UMass Amherst. Some housekeeping: if you have any comments, questions, please put them in the chat throughout the event, and stay muted as we go through so there's no feedback for the panelists and so everyone can hear them clearly. While we're on Zoom, we hope this feels like a discussion that we would have in person, so the chat helps with that, and we encourage you to use it. The event is being recorded. We will make it available later for those who could not attend. And it is currently being live streamed to the local channel 15 in Amherst by Amherst Media. So a huge thank you to Amherst Media for doing that and being here today. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Commonwealth Honors College at UMass Amherst, the Journalism Department at UMass Amherst, and the Political Science Department at UMass Amherst for all their support and help with this event. Before we get started, we would also like to acknowledge, before we begin the panel, that we are coming together today directly after the Derek Chauvin trial verdict of guilty was released, in a decision that has been building up for a year and will continue to build with other decisions and implications. The trial, in which we've seen the systemic racism of the US criminal justice system and the entirety of US police brutality, tried, analyzed, and defended, has been painful and difficult, historical, traumatic, and deeply personal for so many people here and around the world. Thank you for being here with us today. We hope that in today's conversation, we can share this space while understanding this context that we are joining in and what it represents for people here. Now I'm going to get started with the panel discussion portion of the evening by introducing our moderator, Dr. Razvan Sibii. Dr. Razvan Sibii is a senior lecturer in the journalism department at UMass Amherst, as well as a freelance journalist. He teaches up and down the curriculum in journalism and in the Honors College at UMass Amherst, including classes about mass incarceration, and he has also taught journalism workshops in the Hampshire County Jail and has co-taught a fully credited course called Social Justice Journalism to a mixed class of UMass students and incarcerated men. He writes a monthly column in the Daily Hampshire Gazette about incarceration and immigration. Thank you, Roz, for moderating and for in so many ways connecting all of us here today and connecting us to the panelists. I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Claire. It is my pleasure to introduce our amazing panel today. Right after I introduce each speaker, I will also ask that speaker to spend about 3 minutes sharing with us a few more things about themselves and the organizations that they work with. After everyone has spoken, I will ask each guest to take another 5 to 7 minutes to talk to us about the impact that COVID-19 has had on their lives and their work. So our first guest speaker is Ernst Fenelon Jr., who is an author, public speaker, holistic justice advocate, moderator, and life coach with over 30 years of experience with American prison systems, including being incarcerated the first 14 and a half of those years. He has worked in the re-entry field for the past decade and currently works with multiple organizations such as the Prison Education Project and the Reintegration Academy. Welcome to the panel, Ernst. Can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you to UMass PAC for putting on this incredible conversation that we're having today. I'm privileged to be here speaking from Southern California. This is where I reside. This is where I do my work. As Roz stated, that I was incarcerated for 14 and a half years, been home for about 15 and a half. During that time, I've had the opportunity to experience both the inside and outside and be able to really directly deal with the issues at hand. We'll get deeper into how COVID has impacted, but once I got out, I got connected with the Prison Education Project and began to work with that group as my primary source and then the Reintegration Academy that provides an inside and outside approach to reentry. And so I've come with that voice of experience. I myself was also shot by the police upon arrest. So I have that, as well as traveling through the California Department of Corrections from Southern California to Northern California, different institutions, and litigated against the Department of Corrections as well under different conditions that were present. So that's where I speak from.
Thank you. Our second guest speaker today is Paige Dukes, who is a communications associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, which is an organization that works for equality, dignity, and justice for people impacted by the criminal legal system in the Southern states. Previously incarcerated, she is now a core organizer with Mourning Our Losses, which is a crowdsourced online memorial that was launched in May of 2020 to profile those who have died of COVID-19 in the nation's jails, prisons, and immigration detention facilities. Welcome to the panel, Paige. Please introduce yourself a little more.
Thank you, Raz. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me here tonight. As you mentioned, I'm here at Atlanta, Georgia, where I work with the Southern Center for Human Rights, sharing our clients' stories and stories of our work. And I also am a core organizer with Mourning Our Losses, and I'm very happy to talk more about that liberatory memory work, creating space for the disenfranchised grief of people in prison and their loved ones. And also, I am a core organizer with Georgia Freedom Letters, which is a pen pal project here in Georgia, connecting people on the inside and the outside to work towards abolition and political education. And as you mentioned, I'm formerly incarcerated. I was released about 4 years ago after spending 10 years in Georgia state prisons. And I'm very happy to be a part of this panel and among my comrades who have been doing this work for decades.
Thank you. Our third guest speaker is Dr. Kathryn Nowotny, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Miami. She's an expert on the intersection between the criminal justice system and public health, including the question of correctional health care. She is a co-founder of the COVID Prison Project, which is an initiative that has brought together various public health scientists across the US to create a database with the most recent information on the state of COVID-19 infections in correctional facilities around the country. Welcome, Kathryn, and please introduce yourself a little bit more.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. And like, people before me, I'm really glad to be here, and I really appreciate the students for organizing this panel. I have the Miami Health and Justice Lab. I'm here in Miami, and my lab is dedicated, as Roz mentioned, to researching or understanding the impact of mass incarceration on health inequalities in the United States. So in my work, I view mass incarceration as an important mechanism of racial control. And so I really center thinking about what is this doing to the health of our nation, and what is this doing to the health of minoritized populations? What does this mean for like long-term mortality and these other sort of health costs? And so, that takes on a lot of different things in terms of, doing research with people who are currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, to look at different things related to healthcare, health, the collateral impacts on health of incarceration and so forth. And so what we'll be talking about tonight is my experience with COVID Prison Project. My colleague and I, at the beginning of the pandemic, right, if anybody who knows anything about prisons, I would have been able to predict that COVID was going to be real bad in prisons and jails, especially because we did not have that much faith, I will say, in sort of the oversight and implementation of the pandemic, of mitigation strategies. So we started COVID Prison Project to track what was happening and to try to push and hold jurisdictions accountable in terms of their data transparency. We feel that as data scientists, data transparency is really important for understanding what's happening, and to try to implement best practices or figure out what best practices might be. So thank you all.
Thank you. Our fourth guest speaker is Eugene Youngblood, who is a care coordinator with the Freedom Project, an organization in Washington State on whose behalf he meets with people who have been system impacted and determines what kind of wraparound services they need. Eugene was incarcerated at the age of 18 and was in prison for 29 years before having his sentence commuted by the governor of Washington State. He was released last month. In prison, he was one of the leaders of the Black Prisoners Caucus. Last year, while still in prison, he contracted and survived COVID-19. Welcome, Eugene. Share with us a little bit about who you are and what you are up to.
Okay, thank you. And first off, I just want to say thank you to the folks that was involved, the students and the rest of the committee and faculty who took the time to put this together. I know it was a tiring effort to try to bring everybody together in the same space. And I just want to give recognition to the work that's done behind the scenes, not just for those of us who happen to be on the camera. And so first off, I would like to say that my name is Eugene Youngblood, and I'm formerly incarcerated. Like you said, I went to prison at 18. I was released at the age of 48. Today is my 46th day in freedom. And I was released by the governor on executive clemency. And I work for the Freedom Project, a nonprofit that does wraparound services for the community, like you said, about people who have been systemically impacted by the system. And they talk to me, my title is care coordinator. They talk to me, we sit down and have a discussion, and then I write a supplemental report about what services I believe are best suited for them, because we know that people who have been impacted by trauma sometimes don't even know what services they need. But at the same time, everything has to be about the impacted person being at the table. So I don't just make a decision and say, hey, this is what they need. I sit down and talk to them, and we kind of come up with a plan together to execute which ways will be best to support them and give them the support they need. And while we provide resource, we're more about relationship and less about resource. Anybody can give somebody some money. We're there to provide care. And what care does is make people feel better about themselves. And then in that turn, it rises their self-esteem. And then they can go on to become better people and make better choices in their life. And we help them do that, again, in the relationship concept by continuing to build that and carry that on. So our relationship with them doesn't end once we provide services. We try to stay in touch with them, you know, and this goes on in perpetuity. And so, again, I'm here to talk about my own personal experience with COVID, what happened with me right before I was released, and things like that. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And finally, our fifth guest speaker today is Jesse Vasquez, who works with Arsola's Distribution and Community Services in Oakland, California, an organization that distributes food to those who need it and also helps formerly incarcerated individuals get transitional and long-term housing. He was incarcerated at age 17 and was in prison for 19 years. He served as the editor-in-chief of San Quentin News, the nation's most esteemed prison newspaper. Welcome to the panel, Jesse. And can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, thank you. First and foremost, it's great to be free. But I reside in Oakland. I've been out for 2 years, and I think some of my greatest accomplishments have been just being able to serve my community. Being editor-in-chief at San Quentin State Prison was one of the highlights of my incarceration, if there can ever be a highlight of incarceration. I think I've learned a lot in terms of networking and community building with that regard. And some of the things that I've currently been involved in, not only a project manager for one of the longest housing projects here in Oakland, but I'm also the outside operations coordinator for Friends of San Quentin News, which is working towards developing an outside platform for professional development for men and women coming home who want to pursue journalism as a career. And I also try and help out the community with whatever resources that I can connect them to. Some of the issues that I've had so far with the pandemic was just overcoming the barriers that were amplified because of it.
Great, thank you so much. At this point, I will ask each one of our speakers to take another 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the topic that headlines the panel, the pandemic behind bars, and about how COVID-19 has affected their lives and their work. And we'll start this time with Kathryn, if that's okay with you, Kathryn.
Sure. So I am happy to tell y'all more about, COVID Prison Project. And this is going to be, kind of the epidemiological overview of what we know. What are the numbers, right? And in terms of numbers, we've been, as I mentioned, we've been tracking, as you can imagine, all prison systems report data in very different ways. There's no standardization or oversight in what it is they're reporting. Sometimes there's like no definition. So we try and call and be like, what does this even mean? And so a lot of our time is spent really just curating and cleaning data and trying to figure out what it means. So we can come up with 4 main numbers, which is to date, at least 390,000 people in US prisons have been infected with COVID-19. That's about 30% of the prison population, which is higher than the general population. About 2,500 people in prisons have died from COVID-19, which I strongly believe is a gross undercount. In addition to cases, I think cases are even more grossly undercounted, and I can talk more about that. We're also trying to track, in general, death and custody reporting by law. All prison systems are supposed to report deaths that occur within their custody, and they're required to have autopsies. But that reporting process is very slow. So the data repositories are like 5 years behind, so they're not timely data reporting. And autopsies are not usually actually performed because a lot of states get around this by doing like visual or historic autopsies, right? Social autopsies. So cause of death is really questionable. Sorry, I'm getting into a lot of details, but this is all to say we've been trying to figure out from prison systems like how many people died in custody in 2020 and trying to estimate how much undercounting of COVID-19 deaths are happening. And so we've been able to determine that there's a lot of excess death that's happening behind bars in excess of COVID-19. Also, like 95,000 staff members have been infected with COVID-19, which is a lot as well. And that's also really undercounted because most jurisdictions don't require or offer testing for their staff. And we know there's been documented epidemiological studies where it's staff, right, that are bringing cases into the prisons. I mean, they're the ones that are introducing it because they're the ones that are going back and forth, between the community. So not testing them is not only putting them in danger, but putting people incarcerated in danger as well. And then 162 people, staff members, have died to date. And so those are like the big picture numbers. And we've also been kind of tracking like, well, what does this mean? What is the risk of death? And for most states, the COVID-19 case rate in prisons dwarfs the case rate in the community. And same thing when we look at things like mortality risk. So if you do adjustments, the risk of dying from COVID-19 is 3 times higher in prisons than it is in the general population. And so this is all to say we know, right, that there's this higher epidemiological risk. We know why prisons, I don't have to tell our panel, but, prisons are unsanitary, they're overcrowded, they don't have supplies like hand sanitizer, you don't necessarily have free liberty to wash your hands whenever you want with, soap. And so prisons in a lot of ways amplify disease risk. And this is true of influenza, of tuberculosis, of everything. And so we've been pushing to try to get greater data transparency. And we've also been trying to use our data. We have a mechanism where nonprofits or activists can request fact sheets from us for like different topics or different states, which we provide using our data. And it's been really, I think, rewarding that we've heard stories of people who've been able to successfully use our fact sheets to advocate for things like, you need to pay for a hotel for people that are being released because they want to be able to quarantine before they go see their family, right? Or to advocate for these kind of changes. And so I think we see ourselves as pushing the systems for accountability and then being able to provide data for people that are doing the great work on the ground and locally, right? Making things happen at the local level. Yeah, I'll say one of the other things that I think has been kind of surprising, actually, well, not surprising, but it's just tell-worthy, is watching the vaccine rollout. So we've been tracking the vaccine rollout and vaccine plans for dissemination really closely. And at the beginning, back in October, states were required to submit their plans for vaccine distribution. And a lot of states did not prioritize incarcerated people. They did not include them at all. In my state, Florida, the governor came out and made really harsh statements about, deservingness and who's deserving of vaccines, and finally changed his mind like 2 weeks ago. So we finally got vaccines in our state here, which is really great. But this is all to say, this is just the beginning, and we still have so much more work to do. Yeah, and I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Same question for Eugene. How has the pandemic affected your life?
So it affected my life really in a dramatic way while I was inside. And so what happened is on December the 8th, I found out that the governor was going to sign off on my clemency. So imagine that I had been waiting for 18 months to find out. And so imagine my elation and, my happiness about that, because I thought that I was going to spend the rest of my life in prison. So on December the 8th, I found that out. On January 8th, exactly 30 days later, I tested positive for COVID. Not only did I test positive, everybody in my entire unit, 375 people, tested either positive or inconclusive. And so what they did to us is they put us in what they call medical isolation. But all they did was move guys who were in isolation to another unit and then just put us in isolation. So now we're sick and we just was placed in isolation and on status. So I'm not getting no fresh air. I'm not able to move around. The light is on 24 hours a day, so I can't sleep. So all these things are exacerbating the COVID and the issues and stuff. So it got so bad that I had to go to the hospital on the 3rd floor at the institution and get oxygen treatment. And so now I'm thinking, man, I done made it this far, all the way here. The governor said he's going to release me. And now I'm thinking I'm going to die. This is how I feel. So imagine like the emotional thing that I'm going through behind this. Then I was weak. And then once I did 12 days in medical isolation, I was sent to the gym. And so for context, our gym, when it's regular movement population, we can only have 100 people in the gym. They were making us live in there with 125 people, and we were sleeping on cots that were about 3 feet off the ground. And I'm 6'4", 288 pounds, and I'm sleeping on a cot that's 3 feet off the ground for another 14 days. We was in there and it looked like Hurricane Katrina. It looked like something right out of the FEMA, right? Like it was ridiculous. And we was getting very little treatment. The best thing we got is we got bottled water. But other than that, we had portable toilets, portable showers. So we had 6 showers and 6 toilets for 125 prisoners. Like the treatment was ridiculous. And then even when we came off and people were cycling back to the units, when we were going back to the units, it was just hard pressed living and trying to be in an environment where you can't have 6 feet social distance, where you can't have clean behind you, where they were taking the hand sanitizer, talking about because it had alcohol and they didn't want us to have access to that. So they're taking that from us. So not only did we not have it available readily, we didn't have it available at all. And inside, the only place available for you to wash your hands is inside your cell. So once you go inside your cell, they locking you in. So folks ain't trying to go inside the cell, which means they're not washing their hands. And so the whole thing was just ridiculous about how they handled it, how it handled with us and everything else. I was fortunate enough to come out on the other side of it and be okay, relatively healthy. And I don't know, because I had some other health concerns. And so I don't know the long lasting factors, and I'm worried about that. I don't know the long lasting factors from having went through that. And then now back in the community, I'm here, I'm in the community. And yesterday was the first day I did a speaking engagement where in front of real people. I've been doing everything on COVID. Everything on Zoom because of COVID. So it's really knocked down. And I only go to work Tuesday and Thursday. The rest of the time I do remote. So COVID is still having a heavy effect on me, my life, and moving forward.
Thank you. Next up is Jesse. How has the pandemic influenced your life?
So one of the things for me, I paroled from San Quentin State Prison, not last year, the year before last, a year before the pandemic hit. And San Quentin was one of the prisons that was hit worst by the pandemic. 28 deaths and 1 staff member passed away because of COVID. And a lot of my friends were impacted by it. I had about 4 friends who passed away because of it, you know, and a lot of the guys that died were acquaintances or somewhat, you know, associated with me. I mean, I knew just about everybody at the prison, having spent a couple of years there. So I took it kind of hard, but at the same time I was working, you know, I was an essential worker. I was a contract employee for the Alameda County Community Food Bank to coordinate logistics for emergency site distribution. So they had us working with the police and the sheriff's department, ironically, distributing food to everybody who did not have, you know, income. After the first 2-3 months of COVID, people weren't working. We were in shelter in place, only essential workers out. Like, the thing I enjoyed most about it was the freeways were clear. I could drive into the city 10 minutes and then drive back to Oakland with no traffic, right? But it was unfortunate. It looked like a ghost town. When my coworkers at the newspaper were finally able to call, and they told me about how every building, as soon as the pandemic hit, like, it was man down constantly, every day, every night, to the point where the staff was just telling them, like, look, don't go nowhere. They would just have medical in the building because they had to respond to so many man downs. People couldn't breathe. People were having anxiety attacks. Like, the guys were just going through it. And it was just a matter of time until it would hit everybody. Like, it was inevitable. So there was like this fear factor that would come over them. And for me, there was this sense of impotence. Because out here, you know, I got out, there's that sense of survivor's guilt, you know, because I had a couple life sentences and the governor also commuted my sentence and let me come home, you know, about 25 years before I was eligible for parole. So I consider myself fortunate. And at the same time, it's like I left my brothers back there. I left a lot of friends. And when my cellmate would call, it was always like he was coughing and he's like, I think I got it this time. You know, so my cellmate caught it twice. And, you know, by the second time, he's like, well, if it didn't kill me the first time, you know, maybe I got a better shot the second time. So fortunately, he still made it, you know, and just last Thursday, I picked up my best friend, Richard Richardson. He did 23 years and he caught COVID. He was asymptomatic. But that whole time, like, I had never understood what it felt like to be the family member or the friend of somebody that was incarcerated. I didn't understand it until, you know, COVID hit, right? And then all of a sudden, there's this fear of losing them. There's this fear and anxiety that takes over, right? Like, I ain't never gonna see them again. Versus before, like, you got this hope. And I finally understood, like, man, like, this is what my mother was going through. This is what people's wives go through. This is what their children go through. I was able to empathize on that level, you know, and that kind of just kept me going, you know, helping to serve the community. Most of the community that I serve in Deep East Oakland, a lot of the father figures and a lot of the fathers are incarcerated. It's a predominantly Black and brown community, you know, so the demographics and the numbers, right, for institutional racism are evident in the community that I work with. So for me, it's one of those things where I owe it to the guys, you know, who are inside to try and help their families, you know, and try and feed them, try and house them, try and contribute as much as I can to them. And on my level, it was like, there was one time where I got to the point during the pandemic where I was like, man, would it have been better to be inside than out here? Because it just got like, I just needed, you know, to just like decompress, right? Because the food line was outrageous. 1,000 cars in one day. People driving Hummers, Mercedes, Porsches, people you would never think would be in a food line were coming to get food, because it wasn't just the pandemic hitting, it was like the economy was collapsing. You know, people were just like struggling to make ends meet. Nobody was going to work. People were getting laid off. Businesses were shutting down. And now it's like, man, like, what kind of world are we living in? And what kind of world are men paroling to? So we have problems trying to house individuals because nobody wanted to rent their place out because of rent moratorium in Alameda County in California. Then on top of that, they wouldn't rent to a formerly incarcerated person because of checking the box, their criminal history, and the fact that, you know, you ain't got no credit when you come home. So it was hard for us to actually find housing for them until we actually got a grant that gave us the opportunity to house about 70 individuals for long term.
Thank you. Next, I'll ask the same question of Paige. How has the pandemic influenced your life and work?
I really relate to so much that I've heard other panelists share about how it has impacted them. Has definitely impacted me on a personal level as well, because many of my friends and loved ones are still in prison and I haven't been able to see them in person at all, really, over the past year. And in my work at the Southern Center, you know, we have always combated injustices and criminal legal systems in the Deep South. We've always litigated abuses and inhumane conditions in prisons and jails, but that has just become really overwhelming over the past year. We couldn't litigate every prison in Georgia, so we have asked the DOJ to intervene. And we have advocated for release on behalf of several individuals, but the actual number of releases that have happened have just really been a handful, not enough to make a dent in the problem. And as has been mentioned, we knew that this was going to be seriously dangerous in prisons, and we reached out to the Department of Corrections and the Parole Board and told them to do what they could and to address it before so many lives were lost. Unfortunately, they did not. Our state constitution allows that the Parole Board could release everyone over 62, but they very rarely use that power. So some of the clients we were advocating for their release were women that I was locked up with. 2 of them died as a result of the neglect of the system. And, you know, experiencing this on a personal level, on a professional level, and really, you know, calling it out for what it was, which is state violence. You know, these are justified negligent homicides. I and a group of people who worked in prisons as teachers, educators before the pandemic, and were no longer allowed to go in and teach classes, as well as other formerly and currently incarcerated people, started mourning our losses because, you know, people were showing up as numbers on a dashboard. They weren't even named. In the first few months of the pandemic, we had some information about who was dying. That was their age, their charges, but not their names. And eventually we stopped getting that information. So Mourning Our Losses set out, first of all, to name the people that were dying, because we wanted them to be represented as not just numbers on a dashboard, but as people who had family members and loved ones and lives, and who had a right to exist just as much as anyone else, and a right to medical attention and to care and to a chance to survive. And so we started mourning our losses to name and memorialize them. And we started getting responses from people on the inside who were memorializing their friends who were dying. And that work also bled into my work at the Southern Center, because we have so many people contacting us from the inside every day and telling us what was going on. Our numbers at Mourning Our Losses are like Kathryn was mentioning, everything is so, you know, there's no consistency among reporting among states, especially in jails. There's like very little reporting. So we were having numbers early on that didn't match what our tracking was doing, just because we were doing individual outreach. If we knew that there were this many deaths in a certain facility, we would reach out to people that we knew there and ask them, like, who's dying? You know, did you know them? Would you like to memorialize them? Yeah, so, you know, the work has always been heavy. It's definitely felt even heavier and more personal this past year. I very much feel that, like, you know, I won't feel free until everyone is free. And I feel your survivor's guilt, Jesse. Just having friends that I know, you know, don't deserve to be there. You know, I don't believe that anyone deserves to be in prison. And so many people have done so long. And another really important aspect of the work I'd like to highlight is just the representation and telling accurate stories about people. A lot of the work of Mourning Our Losses is just calling people, not mentioning their charges. And so many news stories, when we hear about these deaths, we hear what they did to put them in prison, as if that had some sort of relevance and was, like I said, some sort of justification that they deserve to die in prison of COVID more than other people might have. So accurate representation and just telling people's stories accurately and honoring them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And finally, same question of Ernst. How has the pandemic influenced your life and work?
Wow, just powerful stories from so many. Thank you all for sharing. For me, as a representative of the Prison Education Project, again, the Prison Education Project is one of the largest prison education volunteer programs in the country, as well as in Africa. We've traveled to Europe as well. And the power of our program is really focused in on trying to open up the door to the average citizen to get in and engage with those who are incarcerated. So many decisions are made by those who have no engagement with those who are incarcerated. And we feel, and what we've discovered is over a 7-week period, by those who are able to go in the prisons and engage, their perspective is shifted. And so this is really important because experience leads to thoughts, thoughts lead to words, words leads to legislation and action. And so this is the critical component where PEP is a non-captive volunteer program that's able to represent. So we come under the community-based organizations. And what that means is we don't go through education. We're not legislated to go in. So one of the aspects is it keeps us very nimble, our ability to shift and adjust to situations. So when March came around and the issue of COVID was coming out, and in March of 2020, and the institutions in California were slowly beginning to get the idea they need to shut down and not have volunteers come in. We knew two things, and I myself knew one thing, was that I understood that once we leave, those inside were going to be in complete isolation. No visits from family, no contact from family, no contact from volunteers. And we knew how this is important. Those who are formerly incarcerated know what it means when the volunteers would come in and create that space for them just to be human in that inhumane environment. But again, we had to deal with the issue of what was happening. And so I remember distinctly talking to individuals inside, and I said, you know, in the last week before the CDC shut us out, I said, do you want us to still come in? And they had conflicted emotions because at one point in California, the prisons was the safest place to be. It was literally the one place where COVID wasn't going to get in. But eventually, as it was stated before, between staff and the people coming in, that's how it got in. Once it got in, San Quentin was devastated. Chino was devastated. Those were two institutions were devastated. And this privilege of 6 feet social distancing. I mean, just if you're listening and watching this, put your arm out. Just put your arm straight out. That is where, at the tips of your finger, where the next person would sleep to you. And that might be 2 or 3 bunks high, right? So understanding that everyone is crammed in, they weren't giving supplies. Literally organizations, community-based organizations, literally got donations for supplies for soap, hand sanitizer, masks, and brought them to the institutions, right? Because the institutions were not competent enough to realize they need to get these to the people inside. And that was a push and come to shove. I remember Inside Garden was a very specific program here in California that was able to donate supplies because the state could not figure out how to get soap and hand sanitizer and masks to the individuals who were inside. So that was a big thing. In California, we had over, they say we had 221 deaths. Again, the reporting is questionable. 49,000 infected, San Quentin being the top with the 28 deaths, which I suspect is far lower than what it really is. And so I think it's important to understand that healthcare within the incarceral environment, one of the biggest things that's important is advocacy, right? Because the individuals inside cannot advocate. As a person who was inside myself, when health issues came up, luckily I have people outside who are willing to advocate. And so it's so important that we're all here and all of you are part of this experience and conversation to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. And I think it's very critical because public safety is here too. Because if they're not treated while they're inside, when they get out and they're not directed to proper health care, then that's a danger to the community as well. And so we have to look at the twofold. And as was mentioned, staff as well. You know, there's so many stories of where staff would come in and they disregarded wearing masks, you know, and those inside, you know, pleaded with some of them and say, please wear a mask. You know, we're in danger. We don't have any safety. We have nowhere we can go. And so these are the important things that came into play for me personally. Kind of talking what Jesse said, that survivor's guilt, being able to go inside and then being shut out. I knew what that meant, that isolation. And so fortunately for our program, we were able to pivot. We were able to use what's called JPay, which is a tablet, a clear tablet that allows you to be able to do the courses that way. We were able to use Zoom to provide some classes inside to make some connection. We were able to use DVDs to provide some of the education. And I think it was important because part of illness is your psychology, especially in that environment. And if you just know that someone cares, somebody's willing to make time to see you while you're in that environment, it's critically important. And lastly, of course, I had an aging mother. Thank goodness she didn't catch it, but I had to be extremely cautious in how I proceeded as well in dealing with that. So those were the conditions and situations that impacted our program. However, our program was able to grow because we're able to use Zoom. We're able to connect with people from other countries, people from India, people from Australia, who then were able to connect with those inside in California prisons and really get a better understanding and picture of what we talk about. So now it's not just this abstract, but it became more personal for people around the nation.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all our speakers. At this time, I will open up the discussion for the audience, who's very much encouraged to write questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up one by one. I'll get things started with the question about vaccination. It's actually two questions wrapped into one, because that's how I roll. But Massachusetts, the state, all the organizers are living in right now, actually included incarcerated people in phase 1 of vaccination. Not many states did that. Would that have been a good idea for the entire country to do? And could that have come from maybe beyond the state governments, a little more forcefully from the federal government? And two, I'm wondering about vaccine hesitancy in prison. We know that there's a long history of medical experiments done on incarcerated people in this country. So I'm wondering what your experience, what your knowledge is of vaccine hesitancy in prison. And this is for the entire panel. Please just, unmute yourself and speak when you want to speak, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
I'm happy to talk about vaccines. So, people in prison don't generally have access to the internet, so they definitely don't have enough information about the vaccines to make an informed decision most of the time, and have to rely on, secondary sources, TV, newspapers, word of mouth from friends or family, or even from correctional staff who we know has been very hesitant to get vaccinated themselves. And here in Georgia, I've talked to so many people who said, the warden was bribing them with like snacks, but not offering, data, or not being able to answer any of their questions or concerns about vaccines. I mentioned that I had loved ones in prison, but my partner is in prison and she's not here today. I wish she was here to speak for herself, but she's at a low security facility. It's a transitional center. Some places you would call that a halfway house. So there are people going out into the community and working, riding MARTA, which is our public transportation, and yet nobody there has been offered the vaccine yet. And when I went to see her for the first time in over a year, I wasn't allowed to touch her, even though I've been fully vaccinated. So there is no logic around who's getting the vaccines. They've just now started reporting vaccinations, but they literally brought around paperwork and asked people to sign whether they wanted it or whether they refused it without offering information. So at the Southern Center, we've tried to get information in, all of the information we have about the vaccines sent in to people inside, hoping that they will share it and that they will then be able to make a more informed decision. But we do see ourselves in the position that we may be having to represent people who don't want to take the vaccine, but are being, incentivized to do so, whether they, have to do so before they can go to a transitional center, before they can be transferred, or for whatever reasons their agency is being taken away from people who are already denied so many freedoms on a daily basis.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, that I think, the term hesitancy, which you mentioned, right? And you mentioned, medical abuses, and, as our panelists have touched on, right, it kind of goes beyond medical abuses. So, just feeling of dehumanization, well, not feelings, like actual dehumanization, right? And mistreatment by correctional healthcare workers, by COs. And so, there were, I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but, like half of states did prioritize incarcerated people in phase 1. But we've heard same stories like what Paige is talking about. That happened here in Florida, where they had COs and, January line people up and say, do you want a vaccine? Yes or no? And like, that was the end of it. And so I wish that there was more guidance from the CDC, right? And instructed all states to talk about how they were going to include incarcerated people in the rollout plan, which I'm grateful for. But I wish they would have given more guidance into how to do that, right? Like, who are the leaders at the prison that people are going to trust and want to hear medical information from? That's going to vary from, housing unit to housing unit, maybe. That's going to vary from prison to prison, and certainly from, prison system to prison system. And that may be someone from the outside, like an MD, that may be from, a well-respected person that's, inside the prison, who knows, right? But I wish they would have taken the time to do proper, communication and education, right? Within that, knowing the context and the culture of the facility itself, to provide people with enough information to have the agency, like Paige said, to be able to make an informed decision about what they want to do, right? Whether they want the vaccine or not, and actually have factual information and not myths that they hear, rumors, misinformation from COs who, the Marshall Project did a great investigation talking about how so few COs, right, want the vaccine, which is just going to put incarcerated people in even more danger, right?
If no other panelists want to chip in on this?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in real quick. So I'm in contact with Attorney Sarah Norman with the Prison Law Office in Northern California. And so I'm going to be the outlier here, and I probably should keep this to myself, but hey, transparency is important. So I have not gotten vaccinated, and I feel I've taken the right to have agency based on information. And I think it's important is information. And one thing I know that the Prison Law Office has been working on is that within the institutions, at least in Northern California, they've been getting the list of those who have not taken the vaccine and making sure they're provided information so they can make an informed choice. So they're actually getting them the literature, getting them the information, getting them so they have that opportunity to make an informed choice. As I said before, when I was inside, the only thing you're forced to deal with was TB, right? Every year they came by and they're like, look, you're going to take this TB test unless you tested positive, and then we're going to, see it's negative and go about our business. But like when the flu shots came around, it was just kind of the same thing. You want a flu shot or not? I never took a flu shot while I was inside. Thank God I never really got sick. Praise be. But I think it is important. Information is important. The lack of information is critical. And I think having informed choices, you'll find the majority will. And then those who don't, then you can address them in a way that's still effective and respect their agency. Because, unfortunately, we're finding out that with all the different strains and different things going on, the vaccination has reduced the risk. And that's what we want to do, is reduce the risk. And right now in California, they're saying there's 10 active cases, right? Now, I don't know if that's true, but the point is the numbers of active cases is dramatically down, right? Where we were at one point where we had thousands of cases at multiple institutions, right? Literally, CRC here in Southern California, they actually had put up tents. They look like mini circus tents on their yard and put the people at COVID, in those tents to try to separate them. And literally the institution was constantly on lockdown because it was spreading so fast. But since then, they're up and running based on vaccination levels. So on that note, yes, more information is better, and having an organization be able to coordinate, having that list, and at least sharing the information, I think is critical.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one more thing real fast based on something that Ernst said, which is about, having agency, right, and choice. But then I think one of the things that I've been scared of, I guess, is that for people who don't want to get vaccinated, that there's going to be a punitive response, right? Where, okay, you don't want to be vaccinated, you're going to isolation. And so I think that's something we've been trying to advocate for as well, to make sure that doesn't happen, to understand people have bodily autonomy to determine their healthcare. And that if people don't want to be vaccinated, it's up to the prison to figure out a safe plan for those people to remain unvaccinated that is not punitive. And so I think so far I haven't seen that happen yet, thankfully, but vaccine rollout is in its infancy, right? And once we, as it rolls out more, I think that's something to watch for, or, that as advocates, we need to watch for.
Thank you. My colleague Yumi Cruz is going to ask the next question.
Hello, my name is Yumi Cruz. I'm a member of the UMass Prison Abolition Collective, and we're just going to ask you some questions that members of PAC have submitted, but we are also open to the audience submitting their own questions, and we'll field them. So our first question is, how does the systemic response to the pandemic reflect the general attitudes towards incarcerated people? And this is open to everyone.
I can go first this time. So I think that the pandemic response is very reflective of our general societal attitudes about people in prison in a couple of ways. So we often think about prisons as being these isolated places, and which they're meant to be, right? They're designed to remove people from society, right, and lock them away. But that's not reality, right? As everyone on this panel has mentioned, they have friends, they have family, right? You go and you visit, people are going in and out of these facilities, and they're not closed spaces. And so I think that has really, I think that's sort of one common idea, right, that has really gone away during COVID-19. I think one of the other ways that it does is this whole idea, which we've kind of touched on deservingness, right? And who is worthy of healthcare, who is worthy of attention? Why is it that the CARES Act spent an ungodly number of pages talking about nursing homes, but not prisons, right? They're both congregate living facilities that house people at high risk for COVID-19 severe illness, right? And I mean, there's a reason why, because as a society, because, the United States, does not value people who are incarcerated. And that's how our system is designed to operate. And I think the lack of attention, the lack of care and I'm talking about lack of care from the government, right? Not lack of care from people, lack of care from the government, from the states, from the federal government, is really telling of that. And just reflects the same dismissal that we had before the pandemic.
Does anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I do want to add something to that in terms of the response that I saw from the local government here. There was a lot of reentry services and stuff, but overall, the criminal justice system is working to perfection. It was designed as a system of oppression. It ain't broken. There's nothing broken about the system. When people talk about criminal justice reform, they act as if you can fix it, when you actually designed a racist institution. This whole concept of mass incarceration arose after plantations were outlawed and after they started losing human beings as property. You know, so when we look at the institutional system now and their response, it's like they do the bare minimum to get by. And when they do respond, it's only out of public outcry and out of genuine desire to help. You know, like when we talk about the pendulum of criminal justice swinging back and forth, it's reform when it's popular, but then it's tough on crime when it's not. You know, it's this public sentiment, right, that keeps swaying things back and forth. What I didn't like about the response, you know, with just like everything in general became weaponized, right? Like the pandemic was a public health concern, and there was like everybody just trying to pick it up, you know, for their agenda instead of focusing like, hey, like we have to like get people the help that they need, get people to safety, get people, you know, the distance that they need in order to like kind of figure out a solution, right? Ultimately, the government, I guess, was like, they're culpable to the extent that they can be for not responding in the way that they could have, you know, but they didn't have no alternatives. Like COVID had never struck before. Like the closest that we've had to that in terms of San Quentin was the Spanish flu back in the early 1900s, 1800s, right? And that killed a couple hundred people back then. But other than that, they didn't have to deal with anything like that. Just like with, you know, when Hurricane Katrina hit, you know, and the levees, and like we recognize all these things. So if there's any silver lining to the COVID pandemic, it's the fact that society now has to look at this ugliness and say, you know what, how do we address it? How do we address this systemic racism? How do we address institutional racism? And how do we, you know, address it, you know, to where we become a more humane society, you know, from a cultural perspective? Because you can change the institutions all you want, but racism ain't gonna go away. People are still gonna be racist. People are still gonna have their prejudice. People are still gonna have, you know, their suspicions of somebody who's formerly incarcerated. I remember one of the funniest things for me was when the officers that I used to supervise working with the Alameda County Food Bank, like I used to have them, you know, like direct parking and stuff, right? When they found out I was formerly incarcerated, they said, who would have thought that somebody who had been in prison would be telling us what to do? And it's like the irony that when it comes to war, when it comes to health, public health crisis, we're all equal. And it all comes down to like, you know what, all of a sudden we recognize humanity. Whereas before, like in normal times, why do I have to justify that I'm a human being? Why do I have to demonstrate my value to you? You know, why can't we get to that point, right? So I think the system responds as it was built to respond. You know, it's not there, you know, to help everybody. It's selective in its approach until it's held accountable. And that's why I like working for the media. That's why I was glad to be editor-in-chief. And that's why I appreciate prison journalists.
Thank you so much, Jesse. That was so eloquent. And I just want to lift up what you just said about prison journalists and what Rashawn Thomas wrote. He's another San Quentin journalist. He just put out a piece with the Marshall Project called "We Are Worth the Extra Letters" about language. And I just want to lift up what you were just saying about the recognition of humanity. The fact that the Marshall Project is finally, you know, changing the language that they use, reporting about people who are in prison is such, you know, a huge step. When I know I and so many other people talk about this till we're blue in the face, you know, people who work with reporters at Mourning Our Losses, it is a big sticking point for us to call people, which seems like a really simple thing to do, but you know, the journalism is another institution that has reinforced our criminal legal systems, and they've held each other up for a long time. And this idea that people who are in prison are somehow deserving of, you know, this treatment during COVID, you know, and a lot of the well-intentioned pieces, you know, might say innocent people are dying of COVID. Well, that sort of implies that people who aren't innocent somehow deserve it. So it is, you know, frustrating to have to say this over and over and over again, but it is heartening when I see especially firsthand accounts of really accurate journalism like that.
I was going to chime in and say that that's absolutely right. I think, you know, a society is judged by how it deals with its most vulnerable citizens. And we can just take a look at the pandemic, whether we deal with the nursing homes and see how disastrous the response was there. And then in specific, the people who are incarcerated, but also the people who are houseless, right? Here in California, downtown Los Angeles, part of the pandemic response was to shut off all the water fountains in downtown LA. So now they're houseless, but they have no access to water, no access to hygiene, and yet they're going to be criminalized for being houseless. So this is just a reflection of the overall society and privilege, right? This idea that you can have tent city downtown LA next to the most prestigious financial district in the world. And so these are symptomatics of a diseased society that has to come to terms with its disease. And I think the best thing that's happened with the people inside who are the prison journalists, I had the privilege of speaking to Ivan Kilgore, who's in Solano over there, and others, the ability to give the news, the real news, to tell us what's really happening in there. And then because of social media, the ability to get that news, right? That's the other part of it, is actually now we have access to get the news. And then we have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, who are we? Right? All of us, right? We know we're involved, but then we get a chance for the whole society to look and address within the California Department of Corrections, their response was obviously too little, too late for the 221. When compassionate release was brought up, they dragged their feet consistently, even though they're under receivership for overcrowding, even though they're under receivership by the courts for improper health care. They still dragged their feet where it was clear evidence. You could have released the people who were 60 and older, the people who had serious health illness, those type of things. Finally, when they started to do it, then they began to do the trickle, we're going to let 1,000 out here. We're going to start reducing here, start reducing there, but too little, too late for those who are already gone. And so I think it's endemic of how society looks, again, at those who are incarcerated. As he said, their property. Once they begin to notice that the property was going to be damaged, all of a sudden now they pay attention. But prior to that, it wasn't that big of a concern. When institutions were being shut down and suddenly there wasn't production coming out of those institutions for the prison labor, right? Suddenly there was attention directed towards that. So this plays a bigger part in what comes. And journalism is critical. The language that we use and how we describe those who are incarcerated, those who are houseless, those who have mental health issues, all of that is important. And journalism is always, I once wanted to be a journalist. And one thing I was always told is every story has a point of view and every story has a message they're trying to relay. And often when it comes to incarcerated, that message is, these are the people who are least deserving of care, least deserving of consideration when it comes down to it.
Thank you so much for all those amazing responses. Now we're going to move on to an audience submitted question. They would like to ask, how do we fight the information blackout in prisons?
So I think I'd like to address that first, especially having dealt with like public information officers and the Office of Public and Employee Communications here in California. I know for the longest time, California prisons were isolated to all journalists. Like just the same way they would keep us in, they would keep journalists out. And that was by design. Like nobody wants to air out their dirty laundry, right? Nobody wants to highlight what's actually happening back there in terms of the good and the bad. Because a lot of times they're part of the problem is they're perpetuating it. Lack of resources, lack of opportunity, lack of hope, so the lack of infrastructure, right, kind of shows. Like I know right now, there's gonna be an issue in California with the body cams that they're proposing. So they have it at 2 prisons now where officers have to carry body cams. Well, imagine that all you see on the body cam is a guy sitting down for 6 hours, right? That's gonna be an issue, right? Because correctional officers get the highest pay in terms of law enforcement in California, but they rarely do the amount of work of enforcement that regular officers on the street do. Now, I'm not for, more law enforcement, but I do believe in order and some kind of structure, right? So I do respect, the authorities that exist. I think that the way that we can combat the blackout is by continuing to hold them accountable with this thing about the pandemic. The whole reason why it was able to happen and these injustices were perpetuated was because there was a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability. Now that we have this momentum, it's about codifying it into the penal code systems of every state. It's about making it a statute and not an administrative policy, because administrative policies can be overridden and the court always gives discretion to prison administrations under penological interest. And penological interest just means that, hey, the warden said you can't come in, period. They don't have to give you a justifiable reason why. And it's like, well, no, these people are part of our public. These people are part of our community. They're eventually going to come into our community. So why can't we communicate with them? Why can't we know what's going on with them? The other thing also is like holding media agencies accountable. Like, I don't subscribe to any channels or newspapers, not because I don't like them, I'll read them. I just have this thing where there's a lot of prejudice, right, within media outlets with what they publish and who they want to talk to. And I'm not surprised that every time media goes into an institution, like the institutions always handpick the people they want to portray, right? And sometimes they do it on purpose. Well, I want to say most times they do it on purpose, not because they're the most eloquent or the most qualified to speak on behalf of the incarcerated population, but because they're the ones with the most heinous criminal record. And they're hoping that that'll come out. And then it becomes politicized, whether it's gun enhancements that are being talked about, the street strikes that are being talked about, regardless of what the issue is, like the administrations always know who to handpick because they know, okay, if this reporter digs deep enough, they're going to bring out some of this heinousness and bring up something that happened 40, 50 years ago. That ain't got nothing to do with the guy's suitability nowadays. It's got everything to do with his past. But journalists should have, some common sense and utilize their discretion in determining whether they want to actually put that out there or not. It's like, why would you want to sensationalize, the same rhetoric that you've been using to keep people locked up? There's a reason why we call it the Willie Horton effect when it comes to media. And it's because you take like this most gruesome act that happened one time during this presidential election, you politicize the heck out of it, right? And then you just use it to lock everybody up. The other thing is that every time you see, this is California, right? So I'm speaking in terms of California because that's the only laws that I know. Every law that has been passed in California has a name attached to it and a face. And every face and every name is Caucasian. Whether it's Kate's law that just passed, under the Trump administration, which is a federal thing, to enhance, the laws against, undocumented individuals, whether it's Megan's law, Marcy's law, every law that has passed, right? There is no law in California that anybody reports about or talks about or highlights that was made because of the death of a colored person. And there's an issue with that. When journalists will not report and advocate the same for somebody who doesn't have or share their same skin color. So I think the same way that we want to hold the state accountable for their lack of action and their ill response is the same way we should hold media agencies accountable for their willingness to perpetuate, this institutional racism that exists.
Would any of the panelists like to ask a question? While you think, I can ask another question, and then maybe we can get back to you. Just very quickly, it's not that easy to be quick with these things, but what don't people on the outside know about the state of healthcare? What don't they get about healthcare in prison?
Well, I went twice to the doctor while I was incarcerated, 19 years, and I only went twice. And it was because the first time that I went, I had pneumonia. And it got there because every time I kept going to the nurse's window, they just kept giving me ibuprofen and drink a lot of water. That was it. That's the solution. In California, it was ibuprofen and drink a lot of water, right? Get some rest. So I caught a pneumonia. And the second time was because I hurt my back working. So I had pinched a nerve in my spine, and that was it. And I didn't attend a dentist. I know some of you probably saw my crooked teeth, right? That's the consequence of incarceration. Nah, it's just by nature, but I didn't attend a dentist one time because one, there was always a copay. There was you had to justify why you needed medical care. Like, it wasn't like you could just get medical care. You can't just go and have it as a right. It was something that you had to justify. Like, are you in extreme pain? Like, is it between 7 and 10? And if it's not, then you don't get medical attention. You get put on a waiting list, for the next month and a half. By the time you do get seen by the doctor, then your symptoms are already gone. Like your tooth already fell out. Like you've already lost the symptoms and everything, and you've already your body healed itself. But there's no and then preventative measures, there's none. Like, the prison diet is one of the most ridiculous that you could think of. Like, I know kids right now in the schools that I tutor and mentor at who get better lunches, and they weigh, like a quarter of what I weigh. You got 200-pound men with 2 slices of bologna and 2 pieces of bread with a bag of chips, and it's like, how are we supposed to survive on this diet? Then you don't get no proteins. You only get carbohydrates. You don't get no real meat. You get fish that comes in a box that says not fit for human consumption. And it's like, so I'm not surprised, when people are constantly ill and constantly have back issues, and constantly have I developed depth perception. I didn't even know you could lose your eyesight, right, by not utilizing it, because you're confined to close quarters for so long that your eyesight starts deteriorating because you're not using long distance vision and stuff like that. I thought I was great because I was mid-30s when I got out. I go to the DMV and they say I'm almost legally blind because I can't see long distance. And I'm like, but my eyes are great. And they're like, no, they deteriorated. You develop depth perception. And that was what my doctor told me. He's like, yeah, you just need glasses for long distance. It's like, this happens to people when you're confined to close quarters. So yeah, I don't know if people knew that.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Jesse said. So, you mentioned copays, which I think that's what a lot of people always find surprising, right? Is that healthcare is not free. That there are copays, and the copay relative to what you get paid in quotation marks for your labor is just outrageous. And I think one of the other things that people don't generally know is that people in prison and jail, right? People in confinement are the only group in the United States that have a constitutionally protected right to healthcare. So in a country where we do not have a right to healthcare, in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that it was a violation of the 8th Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment to deny incarcerated people healthcare. And since then, the most common lawsuits that have been brought against prison systems have to do with healthcare access. Ernst mentioned the California prison realignment earlier, and that was a case about California is so overcrowded, right? You can't provide adequate healthcare. Mm-hmm. And so given this, right, it's like the huge irony that we have, the only group in our country that supposedly, right, has protected right to healthcare, has among the shittiest healthcare. Oh, sorry, I don't know if I was supposed to discuss the worst healthcare in terms of prevention. It was mentioned diet. I mean, thinking about healthcare broadly, not even just seeing a physician or a nurse, but having recreational time, living in a non-stressful environment, food and so forth. And I just kind of wanted to drop a statistic because I'm an Amherst person that, it's been shown that every year spent incarcerated is associated with a 2-year drop in life expectancy. So being incarcerated literally sheds years off your life on average due to things like lack of adequate care, lack of nutrition, living in unventilated environments. I mean, it's truly horrifying, I'll say.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I was going to say that people in prison have, we have a huge population of people who are aging in prison, who have been in prison for decades and have had no access to adequate health care. So when we talk about people being at risk for COVID, we usually think about people who are like 60, 65, but in prison, that's really more like 50, 55. And, like you were just saying, like the US helped write the standards for the UN for prisoners of war, but we don't even meet that for the people who are in prison in the US. In Georgia, people work for free, but they have to pay $5 copays every time they see a doctor or get a prescription or get seen about anything, $10 if it's an emergency situation. But especially during COVID, like nobody has had access to anything, let alone adequate healthcare. And when people have serious medical issues, they oftentimes never see their primary care physician who is directing their care. I, thank God, had a pretty, I was pretty healthy for my whole 10 years that I spent in prison, but I did have some dental issues, and I, followed the grievance procedure and tried to seek care and was retaliated against and actually had my mouth butchered by a dentist who was like, oh, you want me to do dental work? Okay. And I worked in the infirmary under the leadership of Dr. Najir, who you may not have heard of if you don't live in Georgia, but he had lost his license to practice in another state and was still hired as a primary care doctor in a facility here in Georgia, and at least 13 women died on his watch. So that just goes to show like what we think about deserving and what kind of healthcare people in prison deserve.
Just want to drop another thing to say there's like advocacy to get rid of copays. I mean, it's like a small thing, but could have a really big impact, right? It's a small thing in the bigger picture of like prison abolition. But I know there's representatives in Congress that are submitting legislation to try to ban copays in prisons across the United States, which I think is really great. And if that ever comes, to be voted on or discussed, everybody should submit comments to the representative about how they should support that bill.
So talking about healthcare, I went through the LA County jail system first before I went to the CDCR. LA County jail is the largest jail in the world. And going through there, as I mentioned, when I was arrested, I was shot. I had, so basically I had open wounds. And from that, when they got me from the hospital was once they were able to mitigate the bleeding, they basically put a gauze pad, wrapped it around my leg, and then sent me into general population. And luckily, I didn't know. I'd never been to prison, never been to jail, didn't know what was going on, didn't know anything. I was sent, as a Black man, I was sent into what was called the CRIP module, which was a gang module. And, luckily for me, where I was put, somebody decided, they saw my condition, they're like, look, just lay on the floor and we're gonna call man down because you do not belong in this spot. Right. And so I didn't know what he said. I just laid down and he was like, man down. They came and they got me and they moved me to medical. Then my family would get involved at different levels. And the minute you advocate for your healthcare through the grievance process, as Paige mentioned, retaliation's on the way, transfers in California, because they have so many prisons, they're like, okay, well, we'll transfer you. Right. So I went from the LA County jail, I went to Tehachapi Max. Then from Tehachapi Max, I went to a new prison called Calipatria, which became one of the more violent prisons at that time. And here it was, I had a full leg brace. I just got diagnosed with Hep C. I had high blood pressure. I had other things going on. And they sent me to pretty much a general population institution, level 4, which is like the higher levels, and had me on the second floor. And the only reason why I got sent from Calipatria was they kept looking at my leg brace, which was one that I could remove. And the guards became concerned. They said, if that leg brace disappears, the metal on that leg brace will make what they call bone crushers, right? These huge, giant weapons that could be used against the officers. That's the reason I got transferred to a different facility. And I ended up at the California Medical Facility. But it was through vigorous and challenging advocacy from my family that I was able to get health care. And even then they had to stay on top. The warden would get a call if any issues came up. and it was through advocacy. Not everyone had that advocacy. Therefore, the healthcare system was problematic for most people. They didn't get it. I watched a man who had respiratory issues one night in specific, and I'll try to keep it brief. He was having an issue. At nighttime after 10 o'clock, it's called the night shift comes on. Well, what Jesse said, yeah, they came, did their count, and then they disappeared. The whole tier was banging and screaming for help for this man. By the time they came an hour later, when they carted him out, he was done, right? So this is the reality of the advocacy that we have to deal with inside. And if we can add advocacy for those who are inside, that's going to be the difference from coming from the outside, because that's what they're going to listen to, the tax-paying people who have the money to address these issues.
Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. There's simply not enough time to talk about this, but we'd like to thank you so much for everything that you've said tonight. So again, we encourage all the panelists to drop any links or websites into the chat as to how we can connect with your work. The UMass Prison Abolition Collective will also do the same. But I'd just like to close with a few remarks on behalf of the Prison Abolition Collective and our co-sponsors from the Honors College, the Department of Journalism, and the Department of Political Science. We would like to thank our panelists and our moderator, Raz, for engaging us in this really important conversation. We thank you for your time and the work that you are doing for our incarcerated siblings. We would also like to thank everyone who has taken time to join us tonight. The work of reimagining justice is really challenging, but coming together as a community and educating and listening to each other is how we continue to ground our work towards a liberated future. So again, thank you everyone. And yeah, if anyone also, if you are affiliated with other groups who are doing this work, feel free to connect that in the chat as far as our audience members goes. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the fellow panelists. I enjoyed meeting all of you.
Good night. Thank you for this opportunity. Incredible panel, incredible discussion.